I heard senior transatlantic fellow. You should look a little bit different than I do, but I assure you, having worked on Turkey for the last 10 years, I'm honored and thrilled to be joined on this panel with the most distinguished people that we could assemble to talk about the U.S.-Turkish relationship. Had we talked about this a year ago, we'd have a whole different set of issues, and I'm excited about engaging each one of our panelists. One housekeeping note, Senator Collins has to leave at 11 a.m., so I'm going to be diligent on making sure you get there to do what you need to do. And so we'll be excusing her early, and we'll continue for the 15 minutes. Hopefully during that time we can take some questions if we haven't exhausted ourselves. I'm excited to introduce the senator from Maine, Senator Collins, who I just had the great privilege of listening to in Turkey and had some really inspiring words. I thought it was the best speech I've heard from a U.S. official that's not from the executive branch in Turkey. So I'll put a whole bunch of caveats there and ask you to unpack some of the thoughts that you had from the U.S.-Turkish relationship. She serves on the Senate Armed Service Committee and also Homeland Security, so a very important senator and a new friend of Turkey. Senator Collins, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Joshua, for that kind introduction and that carefully caveated praise that you gave me. I did have a very enlightening visit to Turkey. I felt that I only scratched the surface of a fascinating country, and I look forward to returning soon. I want to begin by extending my deepest sympathies to the people of Turkey who have been devastated by last week's earthquake, which occurred while I was there. It is heartbreaking that the death toll is now more than 530 people, but it's also inspiring to see the effectiveness of the response and some truly miraculous rescues. This disaster comes just 1 week after 26 soldiers lost their lives in an attack, a terrorist attack, from the PKK. I want to also join you in mourning the loss of those brave soldiers. We will continue to be Turkey's ally in counterterrorism efforts against the PKK. The relationship between Turkey and the United States has never been more important. We're going through a transition. After all, an entire generation of Americans and Turks have not grown up under the permanent frost of the Cold War. So we have to be wary of assuming that the security ties of our past will assure the closeness of our friendship in the future. We have to keep working at it. I've noted that when Turkish-American relations are discussed, that there are often two very simplistic questions that are posed. The first is Turkey turning more to the east than to the west? And the second is Turkey becoming more Islamic and less secular? From my time in Turkey and the study that I've done and the conversations that I've had, I believe that those questions are totally inadequate and that they miss the richness and the complexity of our relationship. So let me just highlight quickly 3 areas where U.S.-Turkey cooperation is critical now and will be into the future. The first is trade, the second is counterterrorism, and the third is the promotion of secular democracies throughout the Middle East. Expanding bilateral trade is one of the most effective ways to strengthen the ties between our two countries. Opening trade was the basis for the beginning of the U.S.-Turkey relations when the American-Ottoman-Turkey Treaty was signed in 1830. Although the American economy is now the largest in the world, and Turkey's is the 16th largest and growing, we are not major trading partners. We should do more business together. I have to tell you a story from my own state of Maine, which will probably surprise you. The trade that we are doing with Turkey involves shipping some 14,000 American cows from a port in eastern Maine to Turkey to help strengthen the Turkish dairy industry. So you can see with a little ingenuity, there are all sorts of trade possibilities between our two countries. Counterterrorism must also remain a key area of cooperation as Turkey and the United States pursue Al-Qaeda and the PKK together. Unfortunately, Turkey is no stranger to terrorist attacks on civilian cities and other targets. Turkey would be, I would submit, in a weaker position vis-a-vis the PKK were it not for American assistance. The United States has been spending $1 million a day to assist Turkey in the fight against the PKK. It is designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States. Our commitment to assist your country in its efforts to counter terrorism remains unshakable. Finally, I don't need to tell you how absolutely critical Turkey is as a role model, as a secular democracy, at a time when the Arab Spring is seeing the transition of many countries from authoritarian rule to democracy. It is to our mutual advantage that these emerging governments not only hold elections, but that they allow, as Turkey does, the freedom of religion for the devout without imposing specific beliefs or practices of one religion upon secular citizens or those of a different faith. Turkey's example shows that countries can honor their rich Islamic heritage while simultaneously extending a hand of friendship to the state of Israel, something that Turkey has done historically since Israel's founding. I will end with just citing 3 concerns that I hope we can discuss more later. The first is the deterioration between the relationship of Israel and Turkey. I was pleased to see Turkey accept the hand of friendship that Israel has offered in the relief from the devastation of the earthquake. The second is the treatment of journalists in Turkey, and that concerns me. And the third is how important it is that Turkey be a role model, an alternative to the Iranian role model for the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Collins. I think you've laid out the main parameters.
Thank you.
You've laid out the main parameters probably better than anybody else could have in that opening statement. And I'm going to turn to now a friend of the United States, someone that is not a stranger to anyone in this audience and who just joined us yesterday from Turkey, who's probably going through jet lag, Deputy Undersecretary Selim Yanel, who will be leaving from his Ankara post to be going as the ambassador to the EU in the next couple of months. Turning from the American side, can we have the opening from the Turkish perspective as you see it sitting in Ankara?
Thank you very much, Josh, and I'm delighted to be here again. I'd also like to start by thanking the U.S., the administration, Congress, and the people for their support against, the fight against the PKK terrorists and the aftermath of the earthquake. We really thank you for this support. I'd like to start off by reminding people what we've had gone through in 1 year. If you remember last year, we were trying to fend off all the accusations, and we were on the defensive about whether we were, as you were saying, whether we were moving away from the west to the east. And this year, now everybody's saying, is Turkey a model? In 1 year's time, things have changed so dramatically. I'd like to also remind you that the meeting that we had last year was on the heels of our vote in the UN Security Council on Iran and our relationship with Israel. So we were trying to defend ourselves. This year, it's a different mood. Also, last year, if you also remember, that we were trying to predict what would happen in the Middle East, and we went so far as to think if Mubarak would run for president in September. That's for prognosis. So all of us, I guess, were wrong on certain things. It's very difficult to make any kind of prediction and to put any kind of adjective or definition on the role of Turkey as well. After what happened last year with regard to our relationship, which soured to a little bit, we had decided to listen and hear each other at the same time. I think this is important. We have to understand each other, empathize with each other, and this is what we had decided at all levels, that we would go and seek each other out, we would talk to each other, and this is what has happened. In fact, not only because of our commitment to do so, but circumstances have also produced this. The Arab popular movements, I won't call it spring because people are now calling about an autumn or a winter or whatever, but I think it's popular uprisings, and we don't know what will happen in the end. But this has brought the US and Turkey much, much closer. We were cooperating, coordinating at all levels, the highest to the expert level, and I think we have come to a much closer understanding to each other. However, we still have to work on Congress. So I'm very delighted that you were in Turkey, that you saw with your own eyes the changes in Turkey, what we've gone through, and how close we are actually to US policies. As I was saying, I mean, the last 20 years has seen a dramatic change in the world, international scenery. And we have tried to adapt to it, and we think that we have, with the internal reforms, our EU accession process, our economic growth, social cohesion. We've come to terms with our Ottoman past. All these developments, also the fact that we have now a stronger middle class, have brought more self-confidence in the country. And in the past, although we wanted to be more active internationally, because of the Cold War we couldn't, we didn't have the opportunities, and we didn't have the means. We now have both. And that's why we are becoming more and more active. And we think that this is for the, it's good for the international community. It's for the same causes. We want stability, security. But we also are aware that people were caught by surprise. They were not expecting this. And they were wondering about what Turkey was doing. But I think that what has happened in the last year has shown that we are on the same page. Our decision to accept the NATO radar and what we have gone through in Syria, all these events have shown that we are of the same mind. We have a different approach to these things. I think that should be natural because we are living in a neighborhood. We have a different track on these issues. We think that we understand it better. I don't know if we do, but that is how we think. And our US counterparts have listened to us. We're very happy that you are. And I can also safely say, from my point of view, and I do hope that Phil will agree with this, that we have never been closer on our communication and on our understanding. And we do hope that this will continue. The world is on fast forward, that's for sure. And I would like to advise everybody not to make any kind of definition on our foreign policy or the world at large anyway. The only thing we can say is the world is pretty unpredictable. In the last 20 years, we have seen that it's very difficult to predict anything. But one thing that we can predict on Turkish, you see, that's a slip of the tongue, Turkish-US relations is that it's going to be closer, it's going to be tighter, and we think that it's on the same goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yanel. Turning to another friend of Turkey, to my left, someone that's not a stranger to anybody who's been working on Turkey, has a long and distinguished career both in the think tank side of things, but now as Assistant Secretary of State, Phil Gordon, to kind of give the perspective from Washington and maybe respond to some of the things he's already heard. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, Josh. Thank you very much. Thanks to Rich Armitage, Jim Holmes, and the American-Turkish Council for having me back here. I didn't mean to make such a dramatic entrance to the room, but I am delighted to have made it to say a few things about this important relationship. And I do want to begin by expressing my condolences to the Turkish people about the tragic earthquake that took place last week. Just this weekend, our European command has started to airlift supplies, cots and blankets and sleeping bags and other things needed by the Turkish people, and we stand ready to continue to assist in dealing with this terrible humanitarian tragedy. I also want to express not just my condolences, but our support and solidarity over the recent PKK attack that killed more than 20 Turkish service personnel. The United States stands with Turkey on this terrorist threat that was manifested just a month ago at the UN General Assembly when Secretary Clinton and Foreign Minister Davutoglu together kicked off and co-chaired the launch of a global counterterrorism forum. It's also manifested in the very close cooperation that we have with Turkey in a material sense on dealing with what we consider to be a common threat. I think the way that we're working together on the two issues I mentioned is really just indicative of the closeness of this relationship across the board. I can tell you of the 50-some countries that I'm responsible for in the State Department, with none do we have a more intensive relationship, not just on regional issues, but on issues all around the world, and Turkey is involved in so many of them. It's maybe not a coincidence that Secretary Clinton will be here tonight to address the importance of this relationship, immediately after which she'll get on a plane, and after a quick stop in London, will arrive in Turkey for a meeting on the important joint issue of Afghanistan. It's not a coincidence that just in the past month alone, the number of conversations and meetings between President Obama and Prime Minister Erdogan, Secretary Clinton, Foreign Minister Davutoglu, and many others, it just really underscores the depth and I think strength of the relationship. Vice President Biden in early December will travel to Turkey. Deputy Secretary Burns will be going soon. I go often myself. Again, there is no more important partner in the region than Turkey on so many things. In the short time that we have here, I couldn't even begin to touch on the vastness of that foreign policy agenda that we share, but let me just mention a couple of the most recent examples. In Libya, the United States and Turkey worked very closely together, not just on behalf of a UN Security Council mandate to protect civilians, but ultimately to contribute to the removal of the Gaddafi regime, and now we're working together to support a transition to a stable and democratic Libya. On Syria, a country whose importance I don't need to stress to our Turkish friends because they share such a large border and are dealing with the consequences of the repression that we've seen in Syria. We've also had a very intensive dialogue and I think share the goal of continuing to press the regime and to vocally insist that it stop using violence against civilians. The recent agreement with Turkey to host a missile defense radar on behalf of NATO is just another example of our strategic cooperation. When President Obama outlined our approach to missile defense in order to protect American and European civilians and territories and populations, he made clear that we needed strategically a radar in southeastern Europe to make this function as effectively as possible. And Turkey stepped up and has agreed to host that radar as a sign of its commitment to the NATO alliance and its shared recognition of the growing threat from ballistic missiles. Counterterrorism, I already mentioned the joint chairing of the Global Counterterrorism Forum, our work together on the PKK issue, yet another area in which our cooperation is really excellent and hugely important. Afghanistan and Pakistan, the conference the Secretary will be going to in just a couple of days. Turkey's making a major contribution there, not just on the ground in Afghanistan, but facilitating talks between the two sides. Iran was a question where you're right, Salim, if a year ago, I don't even have to put that in the hypothetical. I was here a year ago, and the big question was, is Turkey with us on Iran? What's going on there? And if it's clear we've had our differences on that issue in the past, and we took a different view on the vote at the UN Security Council, but Turkey has been fully implementing UN Security Council Resolution 1929 and working with us on a common challenge. And then an issue that is of great interest to many in this room, the question of the economic relationship. President Obama has felt from the start, as I believe President Gül has, that there is scope for a much greater and deeper economic relationship. We've taken some steps to expand that, and I think Secretary Clinton will have more to say about that tonight. So I'm really just scratching the surface of the areas of cooperation, but I think it's really an impressive list. I don't mean to sweep under the carpet differences we may have or issues on which more work is to be done. Senator Collins mentioned the question of Israel, and I would underscore that we're disappointed that the efforts to reach a reconciliation between Turkey and Israel haven't yet fully succeeded. That has been one of the most important strategic relationships in this difficult region in past years, and we were dismayed to see the deterioration in the relationship. We urge both sides to avoid anything that could raise those tensions and are encouraged that both have left the door open to reconciliation, which is something we very strongly support between such good friends. We also have concerns about tensions surrounding Cyprus. I know that as I speak, talks are continuing, and we very strongly support those talks under UN auspices. We're concerned about the tensions that have surrounded the issue of energy development in Cyprus. The United States has made clear that we support Cyprus's right to explore for energy. We've also made clear that the real fix to that issue and all of the other issues surrounding Cyprus is a comprehensive settlement, and we strongly support UN efforts and will do what we can to facilitate them. And finally, on the question of Armenia, again, everybody in this room knows how strongly we have supported normalization of relations between Turkey and Armenia. We were encouraged to see that the question of ratifying the protocols was put back on the legislative agenda, and we believe that reconciliation between Turkey and Armenia would be good for both countries and for the entire region. So we continue to speak frankly with our Turkish friends about areas in which we may not have exactly the same view. As I think my very short summary of the issues we've been working together on indicates, have a vast and common foreign policy agenda, and it's one we look forward to continuing to advance in all of the upcoming meetings and visits that I referred to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Gordon. Let me turn now to the only non-official panelist that we have, someone that is well known to the Turkish world in terms of being a commentator, a media intellectual, Nuri Çolakoğlu, who's the president of Doğan Media Group.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, when you're part of such an illustrious panel and when you're the last speaker, there isn't much new to be added to what has been already said. But let me begin by thanking to our American friends for their solidarity and their support in the two events we lived through recently for the victims of terror and the victims of the earthquake. I want to approach the Turkish-American relations from a different angle. I believe that there are three eyes hovering over the Turkish-American relations. First eye being Iran, the second eye being Israel, third eye being Iraq. In that sense, as Phil has indicated, the Turkish vote at the United Nations Security Council last year created a big tension between the two countries' relations, as started new questions. But the real bare essence of the fact that Turkey's proximity to Iran, that Turkey's desperate need to diversify its energy resources, because Turkey is a very energy-dependent country on the outside sources, and when you're not getting your oil from northern Iraq, when you are not getting sufficient oil support from Azerbaijan, and if you are becoming more and more dependent on Russia, then you have to look for new sources for your energy supply. So Turkey's relations with Iran, although Turkey is fully supporting the United Nations sanctions, has to be looked at from a different angle. This has to be understood in Washington, and I think this is one of the most vital things which Turkey should concentrate on in order to explain herself better to the American public. Secondly, Israel is altogether a different story. I mean, Turkey has been a staunch supporter of Israel from day one, the day United Nations decided to create a state called Israel. Turkey was among the very first supporters of such an idea, and one of the very first to recognize Israel. And Turkey's relations with Israel for a very long time lasted on a very good modality, although like any other two states, it has its ups and downs, but in general terms, Turkey had been handing over the modernization of its all modern weapons to Israel and had been giving all sorts of support to each other. And this was a good working relation until several politically motivated moves, especially on the Israeli side, and some people in Turkey created a relatively, rather, in my mind, unnecessary tension with the Mavi Marmara event. And I hope the two countries would be looking forward to the future to leave this behind as quickly as possible. And we know that they were at the brink of coming to terms several times, which broke off for very minor reasons. And I have very high hopes that this will be left behind in a short while. Because I think the third issue, the Iraq, will play a dominant role in this region and will shape the things to come in that region in the next decade. President Obama's decisions to withdraw American troops from Iraq by the end of this year would create could trigger a number of very important developments in that region. The Kurds and Turks need to support each other, and Turkey could play the guarding angel of that region. Because we know that the Arab-Kurdish relations have never been too perfect, and in the past, as we had seen at the times of Saddam, there had been quite brutal developments in that region, and it was always Turkey who opened the borders to protect the Kurdish people there. And I don't see why such relation cannot be repeated again. And the only obstacle on the way is the PKK's transborder activities, and finding harbor in northern Iraq is causing the problem. And I think with the support of the American government, that problem is on its way of eradication. It will not be very easy, it will not be very quickly, but there's a joint attitude, and we see that the Kurdish administration in northern Iraq and the Iraqi government are also standing behind such a formulation. That, coupled with the preparations for a totally brand new constitution, which would give lots of democratic rights along with responding to some of the demands from the Kurdish minority in Turkey, would pave way for such a solution. And in the long run, this could be the new opening in our region, which happens to be, as one former president of Turkey, Mr. Süleyman Demirel, put, we live in a bad neighborhood. Since the end of the Second World War, since the end of the Cold War, whenever a gun is fired, it's always fired in our region, Caucasus, Balkans, Middle East, and it's always Turkey who gets shot, and this time we don't want to get shot.
Thank you very much, Nuri Bey. I think everyone has kind of put all the different pieces here, and I want to just dig deeper in each one of the pieces to give you another chance to come back. I want to start with Senator Collins. You talked about Turkey's role in the Middle East, so if you would expand on that from Washington's perspective, and also having just visited there, what do you think Turkey's role can be in this region, and what type of things are you seeing from your perspective?
Well, it's popular to say that this is a time of challenge and opportunity for any country, but I think in Turkey's case that really is true. This is Turkey's time, and Turkey's tone and actions must be moderate. It can choose what role it's going to play in the region in providing a role model a far preferable role model than Iran, to the emerging democracies of the Middle East. I was very pleased, and I know our government was officially as well, when the Turkish Prime Minister spoke out against the brutal crackdown in Syria and condemned Assad and called for him to go. Turkey's role is going to be determined by how much of a role Turkey wants to play. But as the first majority Muslim country to hold free multi-party elections way back in 1950, Turkey has the opportunity to set the example of a secular representative government in a region full of countries transitioning to democracy, such as Tunisia, Egypt, and others. Turkey's economic success also qualifies it as a model for those countries, and Turkey should seize that opportunity as well. As Turkey begins to rewrite its own constitution, it should enrich its existing culture of democracy by increasing protections for freedom of the press and the rights of the Kurdish minorities and women. That too would set a great example for other nations. Unfortunately, I will say I am concerned about the direction that Turkey is going in as far as freedom of the press is concerned, with 60 journalists in prison, with some of them having a lack of transparency and clarity as far as what the charges are for them. That is of concern. The Greek Orthodox Seminary needs to be reopened, and Turkey should increase opportunities for women who decide that they want to work outside of the home. Doing so, addressing those issues, would further enhance Turkey's ability to be an exemplar of democracy in the Middle East. So I see this as being a critical time for Turkey. Turkey's always at the crossroads, and I know that it is popular to comment on that throughout Turkey's history, but now is a time where I see Turkey having more influence than ever before in the modern era to influence events in the Middle East.
Thank you, Senator Collins. Selim Bey, we've just heard kind of the inspiring, it's Turkey's time. There's been a discussion. You said this year is the year of the Turkish model, even though officially no official kind of taking on that. People like the term inspiration. They like catalyst, other terms. How do you see that as one of the most able diplomats that I know in the Turkish Foreign Ministry, of course, with Ambassador Tan? How are you going to kind of take this forward as you continue to open new embassies and continue to expand? My sense is there's a fatigue within the human resources there. Can Turkey's kind of model, how do we approach this with both modesty but also with the potential that Turkey has?
Well, thanks for the flattery. But besides that, let me say that with the model, I think we have to make a distinction on the term. Because, as you said, we never use the word model. We don't think we are a model. We are a source of inspiration, maybe, because our background is much different. We've had a different heritage, a different history. We've gone through a lot of painful periods in our history, and we've gone through a reform process all by ourselves, with a little help from our EU colleagues, definitely. But nevertheless, our background is much different than what we've seen in the Arab world. We have our own institutions, we have our NGOs, our universities, a very distinguished establishment in Turkey. That is our strength. Now, in the Arab world, of course, it's uneven. All these countries have a different background, whether they have institutions or not, and we think that we can help them if they want this help. So we're not going to preach to them. They can use us as a source of inspiration on certain things. And I think that when our Prime Minister went to Egypt, he made a very important statement with regard to secularism. And that did not go well with a lot of segments of these societies. But he was trying to make a point that if you want to embrace the whole of society in those countries, you have to have a secular kind of framework. And I think that this is the most important thing. Most of these countries are basing their legislation on the Sharia, which is a different take, especially on women's rights, for example. And there, if we can help them, so be it. On your specific question on whether we are being taxed, yes. I mean, we're being drained because we are opening new embassies everywhere. Our more assertive policy makes us think. This is really important because in the past, in the Cold War era, we would rely on the big powers. I mean, what the US said, we would follow suit. But this is a different era now. And so we have to think for ourselves on so many different issues, whether it's climate change or what's happening in Asia, any subject that comes to mind, we are there now. That's our main policy. We are more active on every issue. And we are opening embassies in Africa, Latin America, and we're trying to incorporate more and more people. We're trying to, let's say, have people come to the ministry. It's not easy because we don't give them too much options. But I think that we're making progress. And I think this is a very challenging time. And I'm very happy to be a Turkish diplomat at this time. Because up until now, as I said, even at the UN or anywhere else, nobody would really care what we said. Now everybody listens to us. I mean, whether we're right or wrong, that's the different point. I mean, but they listen to us. And I'm glad that I was part of this before I retire. So this is a very enjoyable moment in our diplomatic life. And we're here to stay.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Selim Bey. Assistant Secretary Gordon, you talked about this being the most intense relationship that we have. I noticed that you didn't say any other word, which is very interesting because it's not that it's the easiest relationship that we have. It means that there's these domestic and foreign challenges. You, sitting from the executive branch, have challenges with Congress when it comes to Turkey. You highlighted 3 that have been particularly difficult over the past year: Israel, Cyprus, and Armenia. I was going to ask you, what can we do as civil society, as people who are engaged outside the government relations? Because it seems to me that as U.S. and Turkey relations have gone beyond the Cold War era that we've heard about, it's not just the government-to-government relations that have gotten more intensive. It's the people-to-people, society level. So from your perch, both from the official perspective, but also in your other hat, how would you approach this in terms of this relationship and continuing to keep it both intense and also in a positive outcome?
Yeah. Well, I do think you're right that people-to-people contacts have expanded, but I would also suggest that they're still well behind the government-to-government contacts. And what I described as a very intense relationship was a reference mostly to government contacts, which has been true for some time and is probably more true now than ever, as I tried to highlight by underscoring just not just the number, but the depth of the relations that we have at the very top level and below. But I think there's a long way to go in terms of people-to-people contacts. The economic relationship, as I also suggested, has much more scope for growth, and that's particularly true as Turkey's economy continues to perform so well and grow. And I would note that there aren't a lot of countries in that category these days where you can look around and say, well, there's a fast-growing economy we should take advantage of. That's one place, and it's obviously relevant to those in this room, where I think there's scope for much more work. Civil society, NGOs, academic exchanges, tourism, all of that seems to me underdeveloped when you compare it to what is already a very thick and intensive official relationship. And again, I think from the start, we've been tasked with trying to develop that. Presidents Obama and Gül, when they first met in the spring of 2009, focused on that piece of it, on the economic relationship, and that's why we have followed up by setting up more mechanisms, institutional and otherwise, to expand those contacts. Now, how that relates to some of the diplomatic challenges that you mentioned, I think it can relate in a positive way, because there are misunderstandings on some of these issues. And so long as I think the publics and the public sectors are not fully understanding of the views of the other side, there's scope for not just disagreement, but for resentment and lack of sympathy to the challenges that both sides face. So I think it's important to develop those outside contexts, not just in their own right, but to help us deal with what you rightly described as ongoing challenges in the official relationship.
Thank you. Nuri Bey, you talked about the three I's and the challenges that are there, and you also made reference to the domestic developments in Turkey that have seemed to be equally as impressive as your economic growth and other things that have gone on. I want to ask you specifically about that because there seems to be an interesting irony that despite official U.S.-Turkish government good relations, there tends to be this trend within Turkey of kind of anti-government, anti-American feeling, and as the entire world is going through these challenges, Turkey seems to be in a very different place. So thinking about the domestic politics in Turkey, how that will affect moving forward, and then I'm going to ask the same question to Senator Collins so you don't have to feel alone in that question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I mean, first of all, we have to understand that we are living in a very volatile, very dynamic world. When President Clinton was in office, after the earthquake in 1999, when he visited Turkey, the Pew research in Turkey showed that United States approval rate was around 57%. Then, about 10 years later, it fell very dramatically. Why? Because of a couple of things. First, Turkey feels left alone in the Cyprus issue, as Ambassador Yanel has indicated, on the Annan plan, despite all the efforts on Turkey to get that approved, despite the fact that the Greek side refused the Annan plan, they were accepted to EU, and Turkey was left in the cold. At least that's the feeling in Turkey. Secondly, the U.S.-Israel relations and giving the impression that United States stands behind Israel in the Palestine issue when Gaza was being bombed, the civilians were being killed, was a very negative effect on Turkey's relations. But, I mean, these things change. These things change incredibly fast. I mean, last year, we had to postpone this meeting, you remember? Because of the Armenian resolution hovering over the Congress, we didn't want to take risk and hold it in a very negative environment. It was the time when the Marmara events, residues were all around and etc. So we thought it was better to do it later than do it in a very adverse environment. Then this year, we seem to have a flawless Turkish-American relations with no speck of cloud out there except for the smaller ones far out. So things change. Therefore, we have to take our position. In that respect, again, President Bush's policies had fairly negative impact in the Turkish public opinion, whereas President Obama is being met with far more sympathy. And it depends on the PR activity of the United States. Actually, which strikes me as PR is the thing which the American society has created and gave it as a gift to the whole world public opinion. But the United States doesn't bother to do any PR for itself. I mean, in Turkey, it's a very closed society, doesn't bother to explain Turkish public why they are doing it, how they are doing it, what is happening. I think it would take a bit of public opinion activity on behalf of the United States to develop the mood in the Turkish public opinion.
Thank you, Nuri Bey. Right before you have to leave, and I promised I'd let you out, we have just enough time for you to answer one more question before I open it to the audience. I want to address the point that you're known as being a centrist and a pragmatist here in Washington, which is becoming increasingly rare around this town. And as much as many people in Washington accuse Turkey of becoming more polarizing, we have the same problem in our country. It seems to be the same issues. So from that position, could you speak to a lot of the challenges, some of the things that you heard when you were in Turkey? I know that there were some criticisms of Congress and the Hill, which is probably something you're used to hearing in your own state as well. So if you want to address some of those concerns from the position that you said.
Certainly. If I could just comment very quickly on the answer that was just given. When I was preparing for my trip, I received the information that the Turkish people held the United States in very low regard, and that in fact polling showed that the people in the Palestinian Authority had a higher opinion of the United States than did the people of Turkey. And I was shocked at that because I've always viewed Turkey and Israel, the two consistent democracies in the region, as being our best friends, despite the fact that we understandably may have different views on some issues and there may be frictions. It also surprised me, I'll have to tell you, when I was in Turkey, and maybe it's because the ATC did a wonderful job in helping me set up meetings, but everyone I met could not have been more generous with their advice, with their welcoming spirit, and with great friendliness. So one-on-one, I found the Turkish people to be extremely gracious to me and eager to educate me. So this may be one of those things where the country, when given the theoretical, is not happy with America, but one-on-one, we love each other. I don't know. It seems to me that was my experience, I will say. In the United States right now, there is a polarization unlike anything I have ever seen in my 15 years in the Senate, and plus I worked as a staffer for former Senator Bill Cohen, who served as Defense Secretary in the Clinton administration for many years. So this is not good for our country. As one of my constituents said to me, and I think it sums up the situation very well, these are not Democratic problems, they're not Republican problems, they're American problems. Why can't you all be Americans first? And I know that that kind of polarization prevents us from coming together and to act not just on domestic issues in a constructive way, but also on international issues. And I'm hopeful that it will not continue to frame American politics, because it does have ramifications on our ability to deal with countries all over the world. And Iraq, one of your three eyes, is a perfect example of that, as is Afghanistan. So my hope is that the American people will start demanding more centrist politics in our country. I do believe that's where most Americans are, but unfortunately their voices are frequently drowned out by the extremes on both ends of the political spectrum. So I hope that we will see the American people, that silent majority, speaking up and demanding more from their public figures.
On behalf of the ATC and everyone joined us, I want to thank you so much to you, Senator Collins, and hopefully this will not be the last time you go to Turkey, and we can continue to count you as a friend of Turkey. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we include the audience that has been so patient. So if there are any questions that are dying to go, if you can kind of raise your hand, we will get, you can probably speak loud enough, and then we can repeat the question to the speakers. And if I don't see any hands going up, I will continue to ask questions, because I have a long list here that I would love to engage our panelists with, but I do not want to be selfish in the middle of this. So are there any questions that I see for the time being? Yes, right here, if you'll identify yourself. And,
yeah. I'm Hayrettin Uzun, General Manager of Turkish Armed Forces.
I think there's actually a microphone right there.
I am Hayrettin Uzun, General Manager of Turkish Armed Forces Foundation. I don't have any question, but I have one comment, simple comment, clarify that Mr. Nuri Çalhanoğlu and Senator Collins refer Kurdish are minority in Turkey. They are not minority. They are ethnic group in Turkey. They are equal with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the comment. Are there any questions with a question mark at the end to that? I mean, I could address this as a question to you from the perspective of, we talk a lot about Turkey's involvement outside and its active foreign policy. What about the interactions on the domestic side and what that will mean moving forward for your foreign policy? Domestically, things have been going very well, economically speaking. There are those who say that the Kurdish citizens of Turkey would also like to be a part of this. You know, how can we on the outside also be helpful and not be detrimental? Because this issue has been both a domestic and a regional and now an international problem for a very long time.
Well, thanks. Before going to that, I'd like to respond to the public opinion issue that was just mentioned with regard to if the U.S. is perceived as positive or negative. I think we have to make a distinction on this as well. In Turkey, I think everybody's not very fond of the U.S. policies, but with the U.S., that's different. I mean, everybody still wants to come to the U.S. Everybody wants to come to America. But with regard to the policies in the Middle East, they may not like it very much. So there has to be a distinction on how you ask these questions, how you pose it. And of course, there has to be much more public relations efforts in Turkey, but you have to make a separation on these 2 points. On the issue that you just mentioned, I think that we've gone through a very important development, not only economically, but on our social cohesion as well. We have gone through a reform process. We have gone through a phase in which we had refused to accept that there were Kurds in our country. Now we say it openly. There are Kurdish television, Kurdish language schools. So we made a lot of progress. But as the previous commentator said, they are equal citizens. Everybody's equal in Turkey. And we don't make any ethnic distinction. Our minorities, as you know, I don't have to repeat it again, but is on religion. It's based on religion. But again, everybody's equal. Now, we believe that we have made mistakes in the past. We're trying to redress them. We're trying to correct them. And we have made a lot of headway. Maybe there are still some certain things that have to be done, but we think that we are on the right track. We are understanding more of our past. And once we understand our past, of course, then we can have much more coherence and understanding. So I think that the issues that we are facing on many fronts, we're not out of the woods. We're sure of that. And that's why we keep on moving ahead on all fronts. And you can be assured that in the future, we think that the future is bright. We're coming out of the woods. We're making much progress. And whatever issue that is confronting us right now, we think that we can overcome it. With dialogue and speaking with each other, with cooperation and coordination, we'll get there.
All right. This is Secretary Gordon. You wanted to jump in on this point, please.
Yeah, on this point, because Nuri raised a very important point, and you can't help but notice the contrast or paradox, if you will, between what the officials up here stress is a really not just intense but productive and constructive official relationship with the public opinion numbers that show so few Turks have a favorable view of the United States. And obviously that is not lost on us. We have noticed over the years that number has declined considerably from the late 1990s. I think most recently I saw a poll in which the United States was well down the list of the countries that Turkey considered to be its best friend. I think first on that list was nobody. We've always been behind nobody on that list, which is understandable, but now we're not only behind nobody, we're behind Pakistan, the European Union, and others. And that troubles us because we see this relationship as so important. I don't agree with Nuri that the United States, the land of PR, the country that allegedly invented PR, hasn't been doing anything about this. On the contrary, I think we have, but maybe we need to do more. But when I talk about all of the engagement we have with Turkey, including most recently Secretary Clinton's trip, where she specifically went beyond her official meetings, but tried to speak to the Turkish public. Doing media, you recall she did that cafe on CNN Turk and took questions from the Turkish people in what we saw as an opportunity to explain the way that we think. And that's all we can really do, and maybe we just need to do more of it. But where we do have differences, and I'd like to believe that actually we have much more in common than our differences, but where we have differences, and it goes in both directions, we speak honestly and frankly and openly and try to articulate them. And we show respect, and we hope that by doing so, that in itself is a positive in the relationship and allows the Turkish public to understand more where the United States is coming from.
Thank you. I still don't see any questions out here, so I'm going to turn in the very back. All right, we have one right here.
Mark Meyerowitz, hi. My question is about the EU accession. in light of the situation, particularly in Cyprus and the Mediterranean, and just in general, what are the prospects for Turkish EU accession?
Well, we're in luck that we have the man who's going to be in charge of this. You know, that's if we can just add on to that, it is interesting that perhaps if we had these discussions even less than 10 years, 5 years, 2 years ago, the EU would have always been mentioned in the same sentence, and the idea of kind of the West always included America, EU, and Turkey in this triangle. Increasingly, I'm hearing I've gone to a lot of workshops about the US, the EU, and Turkey, and they're okay, and I don't get yelled at by my foreign ministry friends saying we're an EU member aspirant country, you can't separate us. What is the environment that you're about to walk into in Brussels?
Well, prospects are dim, to be very frank. And it's because mostly of political issues that are confronting us. There's going to be a panel in the afternoon, and you're welcome to listen more if you want, but I'll just say 2 words. We have 2 sets of obstacles in front of us. One is the consistent one, a continuous one, and the second one is fluctuating obstacles. The first one is Cyprus. Unless we resolve that issue, we'll never get anywhere. But even if we do resolve it, then we're stuck with a second obstacle, which is Mr. Sarkozy. It's not France, it's Mr. Sarkozy, and the German position. Now, of course, EU countries change their position every once in a while when they change their governments, so that's something that we can manage. But next year, if we have Mr. Sarkozy elected again for another 5 years, and if we don't resolve the Cyprus issue, and in which we have the Greek Cypriot presidency in the second half of the year, well, I'm going to Brussels soon, and probably I'll just lay back and watch the crisis unfold, and I'll try to pick up the pieces. It's a daunting task that's in front of us. We do hope that things will turn out better. And we've gone through a lot of ups and downs, but it's very difficult to see whether we can turn this up again.
I see Assistant Secretary Gordon wants to jump in on as well.
It's an important issue. I would just say from an American perspective, well, first of all, whatever the prospects are, I'm sure they'll get better as soon as Ambassador Yanel takes up his position. I would also add that even if they don't, your role arguably becomes even more important, because the Turkish-EU relationship is not just about accession. It's about economic relationship, and especially under the Lisbon Treaty, diplomatic relationships in the EU role. So you will have plenty to do. And you're not going to be able to just kick back and watch.
Shucks.
And the other important thing to say from the American point of view, just to have our view out there clearly, is first of all, it is of course up to European Union members in Turkey. But that doesn't mean we can't have a view and express that view clearly to our friends, which we do. And that view is that in the long run, at least, we think it would be good for the EU and good for Turkey if Turkey would one day join the European Union. That's been our view for some time, and it hasn't changed. I think you're right analytically. It would be hard to argue that in the near term prospects are good. All you have to do is look at public opinion polling numbers on that, or some of the views of some of the key leaders in Europe. Not just that, but also views in Turkey. And I would say maybe regrettably, numbers are going down both on what Turks think is the likelihood that they will join, and also on the numbers that want to join. I would just say that needn't be a crisis, and I don't think the focus of Turkey, Europe, or even the US role in that discussion should be in the immediate term on accession. Turkey needs to continue with the economic and democratic reforms that make it a stronger candidate for the EU. The European Union needs to continue to work on consolidating the economic situation, emphasizing that the door to enlargement is open, and then in X number of years, hopefully both will be better placed to move forward. But we shouldn't make this a current issue of crisis in tension in a relationship that's going to be hugely important whether accession is on the agenda or not.
I know Nuri Bey wants to come in, but I can't help but add, anybody who speaks Turkish and has been to Turkey knows that there's only one friend of a Turk, and that's another Turk. And so there may be a unique phenomenon of exceptionalism both in Turkey that we might also have as well in America. But you started a lot of this by having the discussion about public opinion and saying there's the PR side of this. I wanted to kind of reverse the question on you as well, given that you're in the media side of things, as someone who's very well placed to help shape public opinion. We heard about some of the concerns, you're speaking, and also Senator Collins. What are your perspectives from the side that you sit in terms of media person on the prospects of EU, because the EU prospects have been, from a public opinion point of view, have been going down as well.
Well, first of all, in my mind, EU enlargement, despite all the rhetoric to the contrary, has never been on merit but on more political motivations. I mean, the very first enlargement, inclusion of Portugal, Spain, and Greece, was purely politically motivated. They were not up to the standards of the other 6 they had joined. But that 6 countries didn't want to see any military dictatorship in Europe repeated again. The second large enlargement, the inclusion of most of the Eastern European or new European countries into the EU, again, wasn't on merit of economic or political criteria, because I launched a television station in Romania 4 years ago. I lived in Romania literally for 2 years. I've seen how Romania works, where the Romanian standards are and where Turkey is. It's incomparable. So you have to understand that there will come a time when Europe will desperately need a country like Turkey on its side. That's when, in my mind, the enlargement will realize. Otherwise, tomorrow they'll find Cyprus. The day after that, they'll find another excuse for not having Turkey in. But I think when the conditions are ripe and when Europe wants to be a major player in this world game, because, mind you, 25 years ago, we were living in a world of 2 superpowers. 15 years ago, we ended up in a world of 1 superpower. Probably in a decade or so, we might be living in a world of 5 or 6 superpowers. So if Europe wants to be one of those big players, they might be needing a country like Turkey with 70 million fairly young population, very disciplined workforce, very hardworking, and has an enormous flexibility, which can hold on both East and West. So that's when I believe that Turkey's membership will realize, despite all the efforts of my very good friends at the Turkish Foreign Ministry, I believe that as long as the time isn't there. As to the public opinion, in Turkey, some 10 years ago, nearly 80-85% wanted to be part of Europe, European Union. They were looking very high to it because European Union represented various different things for us. Initially, about some 20 years ago, it represented more investment, more employment opportunities, better life, etc., etc. Now, all that has been accomplished through the last 20 years in Turkey by itself. Still, European Union represents a set of democratic standards which we are trying to reach, which we are really working hard to meet. Therefore, catching up with those standards and certain practices which we really should have done on our own, but where we need some sort of a benchmarking which helps us to get there. And pretty soon, once we are there, we may decide not to be part of Europe and play it in a different and more independent way, which, like Norway or many other countries, and then probably Turkey will be a different player in that game.
Thank you very much. I think we have time we at least have one question I saw over here, if we can get the microphone right there to that gentleman.